Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Welcome to the 2021 AP Human Geography Professional Development Night. So thankful you are all here. If you spent the day scoring, thank you. Thank you for taking a little bit of your time to join us tonight. The way we're going to work this tonight, after the speaker, there'll be time for questions, and we'll do that in a couple ways. You will be able to ask your question, or you can put it in the chat. If you would like to ask your question when we get to that point, please raise your hand, okay? And then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So thank you again for joining us, and I give you our chief reader, Seth Dixon, to introduce our speaker tonight.
Well, thank you for being here. This is the 21st annual AP reading, and we're so grateful to have you, and we're even more grateful to have Parag Khanna joining us. Parag Khanna is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler, and best-selling author. He is founding and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. Parag's newest book is Move, The Forces Uprooting US, which was preceded by The Future is Asian. He's also the author of a trilogy of books on the future of the world order, beginning with The Second World, followed by How to Run the World, and concluding with Connectography. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's and master's degrees from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's traveled to nearly 150 countries. If you're not jealous already, you probably are now, and is a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. You might know him best from his human geography related TED Talks, like How Megacities Are Changing the Map of the World and Old Geographies, New Orders, China, India, and the Future of Asia. So without further ado, we are very excited to introduce Parag Khanna.
Thanks so much, Seth. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Lisa. I'm so delighted to be with all of you today. It's, I suppose, a pity that we're not all in person and doing this over a beer, but maybe next year. And I know this is several years overdue, but no time like the present, especially since I've learned from you in the last few weeks just how spectacularly the APHG curriculum and the student uptake has grown. It's just incredible to learn about how popular the course has become. And I hope that I can contribute in some way to the inspiration that you're providing to all the students out there. It does remind me, and I know that some of you are going to chuckle already if you're familiar with this old chestnut, but Jerry Dobson famously said, Lisa's already nodding, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Well, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the invasion of Afghanistan, and that war is going to officially end. And therefore, this is if one can make a joke out of the situation, it is to say that it logically follows that if war is God's way of teaching Americans geography, when the wars end, it means that you are the ones now doing God's work. And in that sense, I mean it in all seriousness, because I think teaching geography really, really, truly is God's work. And so let me just start to share my slide deck here. But I thought I'd start us off with something of a benediction, if you will. That's the closest I can come to a religious statement on the matter. So if you can all see my slides, I'll jump right in. Now, I think that like Lisa, for example, to me, the study of geography is important enough that I've finally stopped everything and taken to writing an entire book on the subject of specifically human geography. And as I say on page 2 of the book, and I don't think there's a page 1, so this really is important. To me, human geography is the deep science, right, of how our species relates to itself and the planet. I don't think that there's anything more fundamentally important than this. And so I really put it at the center of this forthcoming study. And the thing is, it's not fixed. It's not a fixed story, but a dynamic one, and more dynamic now than perhaps ever before, which is why I really wanted to put it at the center of study. And one of the things that I remember from studying geography, or the first time I did get to study geography more formally in high school, if you think back to those days, it was just so static. This is the 1990s, right? Mid 1990s. It was a bit of geology, a little bit of earth science, a little bit on nothing about climate change, a bit on demographics, right? Very, very staid, bland old maps. That was it back then. And we've come an incredibly long way. And the tools that you're now using and teaching and ingesting are so critical precisely to keep pace with the unbelievable dynamism of this subject today. So why is it so dynamic? And this is really the central point of departure. And that is, if you think about the layers of geography that characterize our world, right? And you can think of many, but I basically begin with 4 big areas. Natural geography, again, very dynamic. We don't dispute it though. We take these maps for granted, right? When we make maps, we put green for forests, brown for deserts, blue for oceans, right? We've got our political geography. Again, the borders change, and when they do, we update our maps, but we accept that the lines on the map are what they are. My view, and this is something I've spent other books, sort of contesting, is that we put a bit too much effort or emphasis on this. Why do we default to this being the map that we raise children to believe is quote unquote natural? In other words, kids walk into school, they go to their offices from birth. We show children that this is somehow natural, that when you look at a map and you understand the planet, you should see these political lines of division, and that's the way the world is. And I think that's wrong. And I've come to try to challenge that as much as possible. Then we have our functional geography, right, which is the geography of infrastructure, the geography of our economics, of our connectivity. And this can be connectivity that falls in different categories: transportation, energy, communications infrastructure, like what you see here, highways, railways, fiber optic internet cables. And then there's human geography, us, right, our distribution. And some of my other maps that I'll show you, have, you may have seen from connectography, of every human being as a pixel. And the thing is about these 4 layers of geography, among others, again, is that they are very, very badly misaligned. And we're entering a fascinating, painful, but potentially hopeful era in which I believe that we can bring these geographies into better alignment. And along the way, in order to do that, in order to achieve that, we're going to have to rethink sovereignty, right? We're going to have to rethink the static way in which we've treated our natural geography and taken it for granted. And we're going to have to rethink where we build things and where people live and where people move to. All of that is going to happen. It can either happen gradually, it can happen even by design, or it can happen in a reactive and even more painful way. But we do need to bring our geographies into alignment. So there's an analytical statement here and a normative one at the same time. But I take this again as a central and of course, very, very serious point of departure. So I want to focus on a couple of the forces at play, just a couple, there's a lot more, that are shaping our future human geography. And those 2 are demographics and climate change. And that interplay is already starting to shape human geography in many ways and will continue to in the future. So here is a sort of clever infographic that really made the rounds on social media a year or 2 ago. I'll add again, before the pandemic. And the reason that it was already starting to circulate is because the baby bust that we are talking about a lot now and hearing about in the news due to the pandemic is the second baby bust in very, very recent memory. The first, of course, was after the financial crisis. So after 2008, you already had a steep decline in fertility owing to the financial and economic pressures and concerns. Cost of living in cities in particular was rising. You had at the same time this very stark urbanization trend all over the world that was bringing down fertility just about everywhere. And on top of that, you've had the ecological movements and consciousness of particularly the last decade. And then on top of that, you bring in the pandemic. So the COVID baby bust is based upon the projections that we already see, whether it's for the United States or the world, in terms of the predicted or sort of estimated childbirth in the United States or globally, has fallen, very, very significantly already. So, so this is the second major baby bust in just over a decade. And memes like this pretty much continue to shape young people's consciousness about raising families. So as you may have heard in China, they've just announced that they want to move from their one-child policy restrictions to encouraging a 3-child policy. But a lot of newspapers have already gone out on the street in China and started asking young people, so are you going to have 3 kids? And they're like, no, we probably still might at most have 1, right? And that's China. And people are surprised to learn, this is some of the data I have in the book, that even in the countries that actually encouraged American foreign policy makers in the United Nations in the 1970s to start to heavily export population control policies and fertility control measures and contraception and so forth, those countries that showed the highest fertility, the developing countries of South Asia, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and so forth in the 1970s and 1980s, their fertility has massively dropped too. So what does all of this suggest? Well, something very, very unique is now taking place. And that is something that, that is kind of measuring the cohort size of subsequent, of successive generations. Now, since perhaps the Black Death or the Little Ice Age or other major, measures or incidents, the Spanish flu, World War I, events, seminal events where you had a slight deceleration of the rate of growth in the world population. As you well know, since the Industrial Revolution, it's generally been something of an upward slope. And since World War II in particular, the world population has literally tripled. So we came to expect that every generation would be larger than the one preceding it. But when we reconvene this conversation in the year 2026, right, we are going to have some really gobsmacking data. And that number is going to be the size of Generation Alpha. We won't know the full size of Generation Alpha until 2025 is complete. But here's my prognosis. Generation Alpha, as you can see, is not likely to be bigger than Generation Z. So, hug your little Gen Z, a toddler, preteen, student. They're the largest generation that mankind has ever produced and will ever produce. And that's a really big deal, right? Stop and think about that for a moment. So here's how weird it is. It's so weird that what it means is that the present, meaning you are the present, you are the young people of the world, you are not only the present, you are also the future. You're the biggest generation of today, and you're also the biggest generation of tomorrow. The present is the future, right? Now I don't know about you, I get goosebumps just saying that, because I can't quite remember a time when we were thinking in real time about our own global demographics and observing this unfold. But such as it is, that is where we are. Now, what does that mean for the world population as a whole? Now, I am old enough / young enough, fill in the blank, to remember when demographic forecasters in the 90s and even in the early 2000s were saying, we are headed for a world population of, and fill in the blank. There were various confidence, intervals there. Some said 12 billion, others said 15 billion people. But certainly, as in relatively recent memory, less than a generation ago, people were still talking about a Malthusian trap. And now here we are, and this is the phrase I now use, peak humanity, right? I Googled that term a whole bunch of times, and it turns out it's my coinage, for better or worse. That's it. We're reaching peak humanity really soon. So this is another point of departure for my kind of study here, looking at where the world population is at. Now there's a rapid decline scenario, and there is more gradual scenario. And again, even the places that have had the highest fertility levels, it's coming down. And already in the OECD world and the developed countries, mature economies, wealthy countries such as ourselves, it's already well past below sub-replacement level. And the only reason some Western societies are growing in their population at all is because of immigration, which of course raises the great irony around immigration policy today in the Western world, which is of course that they have such high dependency ratios and require immigration, but we've seen in recent years a rising populism or xenophobia and so on. So we have to work that out, right? The supply and demand realities versus the cultural phobias need to be reconciled. And I believe, two things to conclude this point. The first is we're not yet going to get to our dear friend Chris Tucker's vision of a planet of 3 billion, right? That's still a long way off. And why does he say this? Well, rightly, he points to the world population, as I said, end of World War II, when our planet, when the carrying capacity of our planet could handle a certain population load based upon, of course, the consumption intensity of resources at that time. So we're not falling that fast. So there's a lot that we have to do with 9 billion, in other words, 9.5 billion is still a lot of people. There's a lot we have to do to maintain a certain ecological equilibrium. But we do have to reckon with this peak population. The second, though, is we still have that youth that is currently the largest generation in history. More people in the world are young than old, right? And we talk about the world that's aging, but again, there's still 4.5 billion young people. And I put them at the center of the study because, again, they are the future. If you want to write about the future, you want to forecast the future, you should be looking at what young people are doing. Where are they going? What are their preferences, right? So obviously I've talked about their preferences when it comes to the size of family, but what are their geographic preferences? Where do they want to live? Where can they go? What geographies are habitable, stable, livable? And so one of the sort of predictions, if you will, or areas that I explore is this idea of the global war for young talent. And it's interesting because there's been a lot of reportage lately about what could happen as a consequence of this peak humanity just in the last couple of weeks. And I read one article that said, imagine countries handing out signing bonuses like, to immigrants. That's obviously the opposite of what we seem to be doing now. Soon we'll be in a world where every immigrant gets like LeBron James treatment, right? Signing bonuses if you'll come, because countries will realize they need young people, they need students, they need taxpayers, they need homeowners, they need workers in the services economy and other areas. I think many people do realize that, actually. But how fast will policy get to where we need to be? And then the second major driver here is, of course, climate change. And if you're not familiar with this map, it's adapted from some of the NASA forecasts that look at this issue of the climate niche, right? So since, for roughly, the last 10 to 15,000 years, there has been a stabilization of the latitudes that constitute this climate niche, the most stable latitudes and geographies for human habitation, for agriculture, and so forth. And that is all going to change in the coming 10, 20, 30 years as temperatures rise, whether it's you're looking at a 1 degree Celsius or 1.5, 2 degrees and beyond. And so the shifting climate niche is a warning, obviously, because if you go back and superimpose our human geography map of the present distribution of the world population, you get, of course, a picture that doesn't comport. In fact, you'll have obviously a huge percentage of the world population located in areas that are turning red, where there's drought, depleted groundwater, and temperatures too hot to manage, past the wet bulb effect, and so forth. And we, again, this is the question we need to stop and philosophically ask ourselves. We have a misalignment of geographies here, don't we? Right? A misalignment of where the natural geography is that can support us versus where we are today, versus our borders, versus our infrastructure. So every map you look at, you can just, the more layers you create, the more you can see the misalignment. And we should stop and ask ourselves, and again, have our students, our children ask, how would you do this better? How would you do this differently? Does the map of the world as you see it today have to be the map of tomorrow that you are going to be the ones to deal with and manage? So what about migration? What impact does this have? Well, we have stabilized, or had stabilized, I should say, pre-pandemic, into certain well-established patterns of human migration. And it was much more intra-regional, within regions, than people tend to think. A lot of people have global migration conversations, and they immediately think of this great emergency of refugees moving across vast distances, crossing bodies of water like the Mediterranean and so forth. And there is some of that. But numerically, what dominates human migration is intra-regional patterns. And the largest in terms of stock of cross-border migrants that does, in fact, continues to grow, is actually just people moving around within the former Soviet Union. And it's interesting because the Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago, 30 and 1/2 years ago, 1991, Christmas. For those who remember Boris Yeltsin on top of the tank, you make sure you turn on the TV this Christmas, you'll see some good retrospective footage. That was like one of my big awakenings. Well, 2 years earlier when the Berlin Wall fell, that was like the biggest deal in my life. But 2 years later was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you still have this relocation of people and resettling of people. And then the next largest flow is certainly within our Western hemisphere, right? Either Mexico and Central America or South America into North America in terms of stock and also flow. But as many of you know, the next largest is just South Asians, particularly Indians and Pakistanis, into the Gulf countries where they've worked as laborers, construction and so forth, and then also professional services. So this is my sort of biography. I was born in India. We moved to Abu Dhabi and Dubai when I was a kid, and only then, after 6, 7 years, moved to the United States. And that's the typical kind of east to west migration pattern that one sees from around that time, as the energy markets, as oil was discovered in the oil industry started to thrive in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, and so on. Now, is this going to hold? Is this what we're going to see? Are the numbers going to, post-pandemic, when people start moving again and borders start to reopen, and we can hopefully even digitize migration to some degree with immunity passports and health certificates and this kind of thing, which I hope we'll do. But is it just going to be the same old patterns again? No, it's not. A lot of people who have just gone home may never leave again. A lot of people may well leave because they're from places where the pandemic has not been handled well, where there's been severe economic contraction, and they're ready to move to new places that are going to start to grow and need labor, given, again, shrinking labor supply in those places. So we're going to see a scrambling of this. This was the stable pattern, but I'm quite certain it no longer will be. What about in North America, where we see very, very contradictory trends? And this has been fascinating. Again, the real-time data dimension of this is so interesting because you can pick up the newspaper every day and you can see, and if you haven't seen the USPS people, data scientists who have taken the US Postal Service data on change of address requests, or other more bespoke or proprietary sources get mobile phone data, and they look at the amount of time that a phone number has spent in a zip code that's different from where it was registered. And if it's more than a month or more than 2 months, then they code it as basically being a relocation. And you look at this data, and it's super interesting because it shows that new home construction is thriving in Texas and Florida and parts of California. But of course, if you look again, if you just take the US component or the North American component of that climate niche map, those geographies, still have significant issues lying ahead when it comes to the same climate challenges that much of the world is facing around drought and freshwater supply and exposure to cyclones and coastal erosion, sea level rise, rising temperatures. We saw what happened, of course, with the Texas, with the sort of freak, snowstorm and what that did to the electricity grid and so on. And of course, even if we can posit a scenario where you have a total reconciliation between the Republicans and Democrats in Congress, which is obviously not what's happening if we look at the breakdown in negotiations yesterday over the infrastructure plan, but posit trillions of dollars being spent in the right ways on the right, roads and electricity grids and and other infrastructures, broadband internet, we should ask ourselves, where are we spending on these things and for whom? Because right now, our taxpayer money, a lot of it goes into rebuilding in flood-prone areas or in drought-prone areas and so on. But infrastructure investment is something that is made for a generation or for 2 generations. The interstate highway system, of course, was 2 generations ago. The railways were more than 100 years ago, right? You build infrastructure with generations in mind. Ask yourself, are we going to stop and reverse tomorrow the effects of climate change, or do we need to be thinking about which geographies are likely to gain in population and what we invest there and how? And I think this is an area that we're being very, very reactive. And I'll tell you a little story here. A couple of years ago, my parents moved from New York to California. They were in upstate New York, actually. And upstate New York fits very nicely into the verdant, dark green portion of this map. But they couldn't sell their house for years. I mean, they got sick of shoveling snow. They couldn't call me or my brother to go shovel the snow because we live really far away. And, hot chocolate and $5 was no longer a sufficient reward to fly home and shovel the snow. So my parents moved to California. And here's the thing, they actually, so I'll give you the fairly precise number. They took a 30% haircut on their house. They live in a really nice area, in a sort of, a well-off community. And they lost 30% when they sold that house. And they moved to California into an active adult community. Now, imagine if they had sold that house 6 months later. You saw what happened after the pandemic broke out. Suddenly, if you went onto Zillow or other websites, people were willing to pay just by showing a photo of your house. If it was in upstate New York, they'd give you double because of remote work and so forth. So the trends are so contradictory. Climate change should push us in some places, but low taxes are pulling people to Florida. No one wants to buy a big home in upstate New York because they're not having children. So what do you need these bedrooms for? But then you've got remote work. So you say, well, I'll just take it anyway. So many contradictory, patterns and shifts underway. But ultimately, the climate niche has been the driving factor over time. And over time, this may well become our map. So here's another issue that I think is very central to tie some of this together, whether we're talking about the politics or the climate change or the economics and youth, but this idea of the war for talent. This is a huge theme in the book. As I said, for me, I take as my point of departure the 4 billion young people of the world. And I'm primarily concerned with them because their movements will dictate the winners and the losers of the 21st century. So what is the impact of everything, whether it's the pandemic and looking at polarization in American society and immigration restrictions because of the pandemic and politics, and just the growing competition that is underway among countries, the global war for young talent that's underway, as many countries say that, well, we want to catch up to the US. We want young students to come here. So they'll do, and I won't go through every point, but we want to, in European countries, they'll change the medium of education to English. They'll give tuition grants and subsidies. They'll build international partnerships, with government support to recruit students to come to their countries. And all of these kinds of things that places are doing, Canada is doing extremely well. Again, some Western European countries too. Asia itself, which is the largest source of outbound students. Think about Chinese and Americans, and we're reading a lot about how the University of California system, for example, and others are so dependent on full tuition paying Asian students. And of course, with the pandemic and with anti-Asian sentiment in some places, it's been had a sort of had a bit of a cooling effect on some of these numbers. But will there be a reshuffling of this hierarchy? And of course, remote education as well. You've got, even from within the United States, you've got Silicon Valley coming up with new learning models every day. that make it cheaper and faster, if not necessarily better, to learn what you want to learn, where you want to learn it, but certainly at a price you could afford, without student debt. So the disruptions, again, are coming in many, many different ways. And as a country, we should be asking, okay, what are we going to do, right? How are we going to invest? Where are we going to invest? What are going to be our policy changes to ensure that America maintains its edge in this global war for young talent? And of course, my view is that the students of today, wherever you get them from, are the citizens of tomorrow, right? And I think that you hear a lot of people say that that should be our immigration policy. That's what Canada does. Even Britain, by the way, after Brexit, for those who are not following British politics day to day, their immigration policy looks a lot like it did before Brexit, because Brexit was, quite frankly, such an incredibly stupid decision that they realized they need to backtrack on it lickety-split. And they are now saying, the second you've got your university enrollment, your letter of acceptance, come show up, and your immigration journey begins. There's another country that's been doing that for a long time. It's called Canada, right? Canada starts counting your pathway to citizenship the day you arrive. And that is not a dumb thing to do. And interestingly enough, in terms of human geography, I write a little bit, fair bit about Canada in the book, because, given the climate niche map, they well before, climate change was a motivation for this, but their own demographics led them to realize that, they need to significantly increase their rate of immigration. So they have basically a 1% policy, which is they increase the population of the entire country by about 1% every year, which amounts to 300,000 migrants moving into Canada pretty much every single year. So staggering. And so, Canada could be something of a demographic superpower by mid-century or beyond. So as I said, this is so complex, the interrelationship among climate and politics and economics and demographics, that I don't think we have one answer. We can't predict for sure that the United States is going to do the right thing. European countries are going to do the right thing, right? Russia is suddenly going to wake up to its climate oasis status and start welcoming lots of migrants and be a place that you would actually want to go, right? We can't know any of those things. And so the best we could do is scenario planning, right? And build scenarios. So I structure parts of the book around these 4 scenarios. What could happen? And the thing is about scenario planning actually is that good scenarios at least overlap, and they overlap considerably. It's not 4 mutually exclusive visions of the world, 4 different Hollywood movies with no overlap in the geography or the actors or the plot. In the real world, it's one movie, right? And it's all of those actors and all of those plots and all of those sets and locations all smashing into each other. But roughly speaking, this is the way I posit 4 different scenarios. I call it regional fortresses, the new Middle Ages, barbarians at the gate, or Northern Lights. And I organize it according to whether we'll have more or less migration and more or less sustainable investments and policies. And the truth is, again, you will see aspects of all 4 of these everywhere. North America, Europe, East Asia, South America even. People will cluster, people will behave according to whether they want to, protect their newly found, stability. Again, you'll see changes in borders on the map. All of these kinds of things can transpire. And this is, again, a truly kind of, again, global outlook on things. We will see this happen everywhere. And in the book, I talk about this in different contexts. So now let's switch gears a little bit and wrap up. You may recognize the slide or the image on the left because it's from the APHG course guide. And on the right is a project that I've undertaken with my students over the last couple of months, which is to prepare for you something of a sort of complementary guide that adapts key analysis, maps, data, and lessons from MOVE and other books to the APHG curriculum. So it's about 80 slides long, and inside that it's structured exactly according to each topic and unit within the APHG curriculum. So If it hasn't already been circulated to you, it will be as a PDF. So that can hopefully be useful to you starting as soon as this fall. And the other thing that we're doing is that Lisa and I are actually going to, under the auspices of the American Geographical Society, AGS, curate a set of video dialogues that we're going to have tailored to each of these sections and talk through these topics and really try and draw upon what's happening in the world today in these very short conversations that you can also use with your students. So do stay tuned for that. As for the book, it's going to be available from at the sort of the standard academic discount from all of the usual academic distributors that you're probably accustomed to using, and it'll be available in time for this fall when classes kind of get started again. And the final word is that this book for me and yourselves in supporting it is really getting behind a very, very noble cause. Many of you may know Paul Salopek, who is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, who about almost a decade ago at this point, 7 years ago, began what is called the Out of Eden Project, supported by National Geographic. And he has been walking around the world, tracing the footsteps of ancient man going back 100,000 years. And he began right there. You can see where the pink line starts in East Africa and the Rift Valley. And he started walking through the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East and Central Asia, South Asia, and onward. And I have gone to random corners of the world to go meet him and spend time with him. He's really a saintly figure. So here we are by the Jhelum River in northern Pakistan. And since that time, he's crossed through India. He spent a year in Myanmar, caught in the civil unrest, and finally managed to make it into China, where he is now, and he's going to spend the next year in China. He has cleared many of the geopolitical hazards that this route is thrown at him, and survived and penned and published some of the most beautiful dispatches you'll ever read that have been cover stories for Nat Geo. He also has a book coming out shortly about his walk to date, and it's going to be another 6 or 7 years probably that'll take him. He's already 5 years behind schedule by his own admission. He has to make it through China, through Siberia, across the Bering Strait, and all the way down through North America. Cincinnati is not on his path, but wow, probably the greatest speaker you could ever imagine having at a future gathering. Make sure to zoom him in one of these forthcoming years, until we all meet down in Tierra del Fuego and party with the penguins, maybe in the year 2030 or something like that. But I've joined the Out of Eden Walk board, and I've committed to give $1 of profit from, or say a dollar for every book sold to the Out of Eden Walk before the release date of the book, so before the end of September. And I'm going to support him continuously. I'm going to fly up to China at some point soon, maybe this year still, and go and spend time with him. But there really isn't a person in the world, or to me, who better embodies this ancient spirit of human geography like Paul. So that's just the final word I wanted to share with you. And we can't wait for this conversation to kick off now. And thank you again so much for having me join you today.
Okay, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I'm overloaded here with information. So first off, Kevin Turner.
Thank you, Julie Wakefield. And I don't know if this is because Parag kindly retweeted my tweet this morning, but thank you so much. That was really cool. I just got instant street cred with a bunch of 15-year-olds in Boca Raton. We, as geographers, we probably all want to know, where can we get signed copies of this next book? So I don't know if maybe we can mail them to you somehow. My question is this: it's not super academic or super serious, it's more playful and personal. Since you had your recent book about megacities, and you've traveled so much, what's your favorite megacity in the world and why?
Oh man, that's a great question. So, the thing is, megacities come in two varieties, right? They're the kind of just sprawling, unlivable, but fascinating ones where you can, if you think about a place like Sao Paulo or Cairo or Mumbai, In my recollection, I've gone and just spent days just walking, pick a neighborhood and spend a whole day walking around that neighborhood. There's the famous Dharavi slum of Mumbai, for example. I don't know, it was 8-9 years ago, did a long video shoot with CNN, and we spent 2 days wandering around the slum and talking to people there, and had our own kind of guides. It's on CNN's website still, and that's such an enriching experience to see how people live. And to me, the thing about megacities is that it isn't one type of place. It's not all the Manhattan skyline, right? You got your industrial zones and your suburban zones, and or your slums and all of your financial district all in one. So anyway, so your question, oh man, it's such a tough call, such a tough call. I want to give you a mix of places that are like super well managed, but still developing megacities. So a place like Ho Chi Minh City, because Vietnam is an authoritarian country and they pre-build this infrastructure, you don't see a place that has this vast, tenements of people living in shacks. You see that 20 million people can actually live in a well-organized place, even if it's not China, right? Obviously, regime that's similar-ish to China, but Ho Chi Minh City is such a fascinating place to go. Cairo. I would still, say that, one has to go to Cairo. There was an ancient kind of, Arabic saying that, Cairo is the world, right? And you can well imagine that there are millions of people, as with other cities, but millions of people who are born and raised in the city of Cairo, and they literally never leave the confines, the endless sprawl of that city. There's a photo that my parents showed me one Christmas when we were looking at old projector scrolls of my parents' time living in East Africa before I was born. And there's my dad standing with a camel by the Great Pyramid of Giza, and you'd see nothing but sand around him. And today, if you can Google it, you can see a photo. The urban Cairo, the streets and the traffic lights and the buildings and the traffic are right up to the pyramid, practically, right? So it's really something, you can again just spend months in a place like that. So if you had to go, to just one megacity, I love all my megacity children equally, but there's something like really, really special about Cairo. In the course of this conversation, I'm going to think of 6 more, and I'll just like randomly drop them in totally non sequitur ways. But yeah, go to Cairo, take your students to Cairo. And on the books, I'll be spending most of the fall in the US, so what we might do is, have, if depending on where you ordered from, the publisher will have it from a warehouse and get it there, and I'll go and happy to sign a bunch, or I'll do nameplates and, mail them to you for your students.
Very cool, thank you. So a question in the chat from Annette, population growth is a bit of a crapshoot. How sure are you that Gen Z is the largest? Is it the demographic momentum issue?
It's a great question. So it didn't happen all at once, right? The fact is that TFR, total fertility rate, has been declining now for a couple of decades. So the trend was moving in that direction, even if you did not have the financial crisis or the COVID baby bust. But let's remember, those are really big deals. One can't just bracket them out. They have happened and are happening. And then with only a couple of years left for Gen Alpha to catch up to Gen Z, which is to say for today's millennials, to suddenly decide they want to have more children, well, the clock's ticking on that. And every single indication in every possible country in the world is that every measure that every government has attempted to undertake to get people to have kids has failed, is failing, and no country has thought of anything. Even Sweden has sort of kind of stabilized its fertility rate, but not really in a way that represents growth in the population. And that's Sweden, which is a really tiny country anyway. So the answer is, it's not happening. So how certain am I? It's not for me to have an opinion. I think that this is just the facts. This is what they are. And again, if we've got, I don't know if Chris Tucker's on the line, but Chris would say, hey, let's encourage more of this, right? We need to still, this is not just about how many people we're having like a race, it's the quality of life. And if you look at the suffering that societies go through in times like the pandemic, economically and socially, and the dislocation and the inequality and the challenges that young people have in access to resources, even food, nutrition, jobs. We do need to focus more on the people who are alive today, the young people in particular, so that we can at least have a flourishing 9 billion people, rather than the difficulty that people are facing today. So it's a mix of both. But again, yeah, are there small and rich countries that are stabilizing their populations through really good social policy? Sure. But it's just not representative of the global trend. I mean, there is zero reversing where China is headed, right, in terms of the precipitous demographic collapse. You can just read hundreds of papers looking at this, and China itself admits it. So if China itself is admitting something, I guess that is the closest you're going to get to the truth in China, right?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't see any hands. So next question, how do you do your research for your books?
Whew, I travel, therefore I am, as Descartes would have said. It depends on the book. I mean, I think my happiest memories of book writing will always be my first book, even though it was the most painful book to write. It was called The Second World about 15 years ago, because I got this kind of, well, definitely not a blank check, but enough of an advance to just go travel for 3 years. So it was just me, a backpack, and my laptop, and it was a really heavy, clunky laptop whose battery lasted 2 hours. But it was 40 countries in 2.5, 3 years, and it was just sublime. There was nothing like it. And before I left for that trip, I was sitting in the stacks at Brookings and at Georgetown, and checking out every book about every country in the world, floor to ceiling. And I would grab cookies and sandwiches from the cafeteria, and I would literally just pull all-nighters. So I read everything I could. I studied as much as I could, prepared myself. I interviewed every diplomat and think tanker and professor. But then I went off, and the amazing thing was, and this will obviously has been part of my methodology ever since, it was the contradiction. It was, the world's leading authority who sits in Washington on subject X says this, but then I went there and I saw not X, right? And so to me, in a way, the academic analysis, the literary, investigation can only take you so far. And then you have to go there. And of course, I think, let's look at how analysis of the world has played out during this pandemic. For a lot of people, perhaps by necessity, but I want to flag this as something that I think was pathological well before the pandemic, is that people think that you can just read Twitter and know about the world, right? And that constitutes people's research. So, well, I'm following this guy on Twitter, and he says, and he's my go-to person on this. And, I had a very healthy skepticism about that approach to the world way before the pandemic. And I'm not going to ever give up that suspicion. So I'm going to get on a plane and, keep on going and traveling as soon as I can, because I always find that that reality contradicts our kind of filtered perception.
Great question. Thank you, Heidi. Next question, I believe, is from Ken. Do you feel that Western influence and globalization adds or takes away from the development in developing countries?
Whoa, I mean, that's an amazing question. So it depends on what we mean by development and what we mean by influence. And I'm not saying that as like a cop-out, but, I mean, there are things about, I spent a lot of time talking about this in the Asia book. I said, look, the Asianization of the world that's happening now is not a reversal of Westernization. It's just a new layer. There are things about Western influence over the last 200-300 years, from the colonial and imperial eras through today's capitalism and consumerism, that are baked in, that will never be undone, that basically describe human beings as material, entities that we are. Sovereignty is not going away. Even if you think of Europe as just an old museum, sovereignty is here to stay in so many ways, right? And that's a European invention and imposition. Colonial era borders are staying. forms of government that we have around the world, parliamentary democracies and so forth, and civil service institutions, is entirely, mostly a European creation. Of course, you've had bureaucratization and even monarchies and dynasties in China, but more or less the form of the state, right? And then the Americanization of the world, especially through trade agreements and foreign investment laws and capitalism and corporate structure and even the organization of higher education and degrees and certifications, that's not really going anywhere, right? So what do we mean by influence? It's all of things. The English language, right? English is now a global language. It's not an American language, but it's certainly American English that is the global language. There was, I think, I don't hear this nearly as much anymore. People used to say, what language should my kid learn? What's the next global language? Should they be studying, Chinese? And my wife always says, there are two global languages, English and code, right? That's it. And as far as like human languages, it's English. So that's not going, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, it creates amazing efficiencies, right? In a way, it's a tough slog for a lot of people, and we're lucky. If we're native speakers or native-ish speakers, that's good enough. But so I think, there are positive and negative aspects, but of course, environmental exploitation is something that people would say, well, that's, a Western imposition, right? Sort of destroying nature for the sake of having, efficient global capitalist system and consumer markets. But the truth is that, also in underdeveloped economically societies, you also have enormous exploitation because they don't have the tools to efficiently do things. So I'm still a believer, let's say, not in, or is the West doing the right thing, or is the East doing the right thing, or the North or the South? But there are sets of, let's just take technology as a lens, technology transfer and ideally as cheaply and rapidly and universally as possible, sharing the kinds of technologies, whether it's solar panels or whatever the case may be, that help places, poor or rich, modernize their technology. And in the end, when we do that, it's not going to be that, well, this was Western influence or this was Eastern influence. It's just that technological level that helps us be a more sustainable civilization is spreading. And so, I think that there's just the pros and the cons. I think we're having this debate as Americans. In Britain, they've been having this debate for 100 years. And just so you know, they haven't resolved it, right? I mean, whenever they're still debating whether or not to tear down statues at Oxford, right? And this kind of thing. So, and we're having that debate, of course, over our legacies, whether it's the Civil War or otherwise. I don't think that you win that debate, or that one can. I think that it's going to be about saying what's the right thing for a society at any given point in time. And I think, again, what's so interesting for me, and this comes from traveling, again, when I go to countries, if I'm in Kazakhstan or Indonesia, which I can see from here, by the way, when these countries, they don't say, do we want a Western model or an Eastern model, right? It's like, if we want to upgrade our educational system, are we going to do this vocational module, and, which development agency is offering it? Are we going to do an exchange program with China because they're offering us this plan to develop a special economic zone? It comes down to these like really practical things. The world is not full of ideological people. And I think that's the best thing ever, right? To move from a colonial to a post-colonial, and post-colonial meant very insecure, to a post-colonial, where it's like, what's the right thing to do now for me, for my people? Which you might say is philosophically like utilitarian, and I would consider myself a utilitarian. And I see a lot of governments that just take that view, which is pragmatic. So I think it's a brilliant question. I just think that the best way to answer it is almost for people not to answer it, and to just say, let's move on and do what's best for us.
Thank you for saying it was a brilliant question, and thank you so much for your awesome answer. Very much appreciated.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left, and then we have to let Parag get to his tennis appointment. So I've got a couple in the chat, and then I have someone with their hand raised. So let me get to the two left in the chat. From Chloe, can you think of a government or supranational organization that has taken a policy action to effectively address the climate change / demographic challenges you have identified?
Wow, you guys are awesome. I mean, by the way, every single question so far, I have literally not been asked before. And this is like 15 years of like book talks. I've never been asked these questions. So this is amazing. So here's the thing, it's like kind of a, a dual-edged sword with each of these. Every place where I might offer praise, like Canada, if you look at the discussion in Canada, it's full of cynicism, right? Still going back to our extractive industry, look at how, Justin Trudeau is in the pocket of the oil and gas companies and still wants to do the tar sands. And thank God Obama, or Biden, put the kill switch on the XL pipeline, and, we're still so unsustainable. So, from the outside, a place may look like it's doing the right things. Then the inside, you see that, well, maybe it's not working out so well, so are there places genuinely moving towards a kind of circular economy? Okay, let me name a winner, because I want us to be happy. And it's also true. It's the Dutch. The Dutch are among the most innovative societies in human history, right? As we know, because of the challenges they've faced with rising sea levels, they pioneered land reclamation and building dikes and, intentional floodplain zones to understand where they would need to relocate people, and just fantastically innovative, maritime people as well, helping to really build the spice routes and trade routes that gave us modern globalization. So the Dutch are doing some amazing things when it comes to circular practices. They've built entire towns that are, renewable energy powered, that are doing wastewater treatment and recycling and rainwater collection. And it does rain a fair bit there, so why not? And hydroponic and aquaponic food production as well. So circular towns in terms of sort of sustainable practices, right? So, if you go back actually across Europe, what you see is that there's a lot of countries that have just mandated these kinds of practices. So in France and the Netherlands and a couple of other countries, they're saying, hey, we can now do 3D printed housing, right? That's less, uses less materials to build and are energy efficient. We're going to subsidize and mandate that X% of new home construction needs to be done in this way. Now, that's not what we're seeing in the States, right? Right now, we've got a massive timber shortage because suddenly everyone's racing to build new suburban homes, right? So these small European countries that are really the origin, right, of some of these best practices of globalization. Like I said, the Dutch, you see this in Portugal, you see it in other small European countries that are resource constrained. At the time, they were out to conquer the world, especially the Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch, and so forth. But now they've had to, their territory is very finite, right? So they're space constrained, and they're no longer global powers. They have to make do with the resources and the geography they have, and they're implementing these policies to optimize it. They know that if the Dutch cut their emissions, it's not exactly going to change the world, right? Because China and India are over there with much higher emissions. But for their own geography, for their own microclimate, they're doing amazing things as a matter of national policy. So I endorse what they're doing, and I hope that we can scale it up. I'll add, I know you didn't ask this, but there's been this notion out there for a long time that big countries can't learn from small countries. And in a couple of my books, I've gone to great pains to overturn that. That's utter nonsense. Big countries learn from small countries all the time. Small countries are the laboratories, the petri dishes, of the world. And if only more big countries would adopt the policies, whether it's around portable pensions or sustainable housing or all of these kinds of things that you see smart small countries doing, the world would be a much better place, actually.
Okay, Bill, would you like to ask your question? And then we have one more in the chat.
Sure, thank you, Julie, and thank you, Parag, for a great talk. So I totally agree with your assertion that if people were rational, they would want to move from these red zones to these green zones that are the better places to be without hazards and climate change. I happen to live in one of these green zones in Minnesota, And we've been sort of bleeding people for years, people moving to the Sun Belt, lots of people like your parents, frankly, that get tired of the snow and move south. And so I guess I'd like to be a little bit of a devil's advocate. Maybe people are irrational. You know, maybe there's lots of Floridians out there that are just terrified of snow and they can't imagine moving north, or maybe there are government subsidies or insurance that allows people to continue living in these really sort of hazardous places. Thanks.
Absolutely. I fully accept the irrationality. Again, it's one of the things that, every step you take when you travel, you encounter, cultural, biases and irrationality, everywhere you go. And again, as I was pointing out, of course, people are irrational. Just look at the flow of people still to Florida and parts of Texas and so on, even where those geographies are not ready. And again, it's taken legal measures. There have been lawsuits that have blocked major new housing projects in Nevada and California because the water supply will not be available. So there have been legal injunctions to stop the irrationality of what we are doing in terms of our free and open marketplace in real estate. So sometimes you have to legislate rationality because the losers, obviously the people who spend $1 million, I think they would be grateful. You spend $1 million on a house somewhere where the water supply, it turns out, doesn't exist. Oops. So, I'm not saying the world isn't totally irrational, because it is, but what are we going to do about it? And I'm very mindful, by the way, that as much as it might be good for your property value, but we don't want to move 200 million people to Minnesota tomorrow, because guess what? We're not exactly equipped to handle that well. And then there goes the climate oasis of Minnesota. And so I think this has to be done very strategically and very, very carefully. And it has to be done through what I call pre-design, right? Think through in advance where you would put people and what would that development look like. You really want suburban sprawl? You've got maybe that's a real image, or maybe it's a screensaver behind you, but it looks gorgeous. And it would be a pity if you had only 10 houses and 100 people, right? Like occupying that whole space. That's not a good use of space. Just to pre-design and think through these things before we move people into climate oasis zones or encourage them or subsidize them. But in scenario planning, actually, you always look at faint signals, right? Things at the edges. And the snowbirds, which is the Americans or the Canadians who love to go to the top, I am seeing data of snowbirds buying homes in Michigan, right? They're saying it's actually too hot in Florida, and if I buy in Florida, what if there's a tropical cyclone when I go there? But here's another incentive. I am passing this asset to my children. And even if you don't even believe in climate change, you can still see that, the maps don't look good. And you're saying, well, why, I can't in good conscience pass this asset down to my children, because it may not be worth as much in the future. So there are incentives at play, whether it's federal judges or whether it's just your own intergenerational priorities, that are pointing us in a direction where we might start to do things differently, and we might start to rapidly do things differently. And this is actually like page 3 of the book, is like this irony of the fact that people have been moving away from the climate oases, away from Minnesota, away from Michigan, the states that are losing. Michigan just lost a congressional seat, as it depopulates. And yet these are the kind of climate oasis zones of America. So yes, we are irrational. But again, I'm thinking, what is the right way to spend our money? What's the greatest good for the greatest number? What would an ideal outcome look like? And once you paint that picture, which I've tried to do, then maybe you convince people of how they might modify their behavior one by one or more.
Okay, and I think this is a great question to end on. So Linda, thank you. Is there one thing you've shared tonight that you would hope our 9th graders next year should know?
All is not lost. Be grateful to be back in school if you are. Get the vaccine. Also, travel again, right? I mean, it's we have this. One of the things that I think is obviously consequence of this pandemic and the new travel patterns and the general sense of insecurity, I hope that people won't sort of cut back on travel. Hopefully, the cost of travel is going to come down or remain suppressed. But maybe here's one: have them take gap years. This is another one of these kinds of faint signals. But some colleges, particularly wealthy colleges, admittedly, they have the resources to even give a subsidy. Like Princeton is doing this, and others. They're saying, here's $10,000 or something. I'm not sure how much, but delay your freshman year by a year. Go do something. Go become a fuller person. Know yourself better, and then come. A year later. European youth have often had to do this anyway because of mandatory conscription and civil service requirements, which I also endorse. I wish that we had that. I wish we had national service. I used to work for General McChrystal in Special Operations Forces, and this has become one of his big retirement issues, is to promote national service in America. And not just teach for America, but things, in many other spheres of life. So I would like to see Americans graduate and do something, for 1 year, before they go to college, something civic or travel and gain that experience. And, if you could make that mandatory, I would, because it did wonders for me. I moved to Germany for a year. And I backpacked around and, went around the Balkans and Eastern Europe and then went to college. And it was just, for me, it's shaped me in so many ways. So I hope that, but we have to make it affordable, right? This is not a pie in the sky kind of world. We have to legislate it, subsidize it, the private sector incentivize it, think of institutions that would benefit from having young and sort of expanded, young, expansive minds, doing good things for our society or abroad. And push in that direction. But yeah, if I could, a 2-word answer to the question: gap year. Start planning your gap year, even though you're in 9th grade. As soon as you're done studying for a PhD, start planning your gap year.
That's a great, thank you. That is just, I think all of us will echo that sentiment. So thank you. Parag, thank you so much for giving up part of your morning for us. We really, really appreciate it and are really looking forward to the book coming out. And I'll be sharing the slide deck that you put together for everybody. Looking forward to the videos that you're going to be working with Lisa and AGS. And again, just thank you so much for what you do for geography and giving us a PhD geographers some really great information to use in our classroom. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming.
It's been such an honor, and go have that beer.
Thank you everyone. Have a great evening. Rest up for your reading tomorrow.
Thank you, Julie and Seth and Lisa, for organizing.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Parag.
Bye.